All right, let's welcome in our panelists and moderator.
Hi everyone, welcome to the first ISTAT Rising Executives event. I'm delighted to have you all with us today. The ISTAT Rising Executives is designed to help young professionals in the aviation industry to develop their network and to have access to industry leaders. So we're excited to have Karl Griffin, CEO of Genesis, and Paul Geaney, Chief Risk Officer at Avalon, with us here today. So Paul started his career as an investment analyst with Merrill Lynch in New York, and Karl started his career as an aircraft engineer in Shannon Aerospace here in Ireland. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, as they probably can tell their story a lot better than I can. And maybe Paul, we'll start with you.
Sure, Bridget. Thanks very much and good to see you. So it's exciting to start the Rising Executives program, and it's exciting to do that with my friend Karl Griffin. If the idea of this particular session is for more seasoned or tenured executives in the industry to share some insight on their journey, to maybe people who have been in the industry not quite so long, our credentials as old farts was confirmed over the last 3 or 4 minutes. And if the participants have been able to see the confusion and hilarity of us trying to understand how this Zoom call works, we would have self-identified as being past it before we even got going. As Bridget said, I'm the Chief Risk Officer for Avalon. I've had that title about 3 weeks. And what my journey, I think, such as it is, tells me in my profession is that if I don't find risk, it finds me. My second day in my career was working for Merrill Lynch, based in New York, and it was 9/11. That was my entry into my professional life. Merrill Lynch fired, oh, by the way, they were based in the World Financial Center right next to the World Trade Center. And in October 2001, Merrill Lynch fired 9,000 people. And continued with monthly rounds of firings thereafter. It was just an appalling time. And after a year, I returned to Ireland with my fiance because she wasn't able to work. They shut the visa system. She was European too. And so we returned to Ireland with no jobs. I answered a job ad in a newspaper for a small aircraft leasing company in August 2002. And I had no idea about airplanes. I didn't know the front end of an airplane from the back end. And I met a guy called Donald Slattery, who was the CEO of that startup leasing company. And I've been working for him in various guises ever since, which sounds, oh, that must have been straightforward and that's been fairly smooth, but it was anything but. So that business, RBS Aviation Capital, where I also met Karl, grew to be the third biggest aircraft leasing company in the world in a matter of years. Donald got a promotion to run a much bigger business for the Royal Bank of Scotland in London. And I went and worked for him there, establishing and running their international corporate jet finance business. Donald then left and I remained for a period of time, and he created a private equity company called Clark Capital, which I subsequently left RBS and joined him there. I'm in my mid-20s at this point. And immediately I was put on secondment to write a business plan and hire a management team for a brand new concept, a private jet airline in Europe. And we raised tens of millions of dollars, found a low-cost airline management team, bought 100 airplanes from Embraer, small ones. And we were just about to launch that business, but we needed another round of capital raising. And we hired in all the management team, et cetera, at the end of 2007. And so I was exiting that business as the crisis, that great financial crisis, loomed. Subsequently, that business failed because we failed to get the last round of financing. And I moved to the US to set up the US operation for this private equity firm, Clark Capital. And 9 months later, Clark failed. And at 29, and with 3 babies under 3 and 1 on the way, I found myself in a foreign country, penniless, jobless, and with all of the extraordinary stresses that come with that. I still to this day in my office in New York have a card that a friend sent me that has the number 7 on it. It was it's a card for someone who has turned 7, but he sent it to me because at our lowest ebb, we had 7 days before we were going to not be able to make rent in early 2010. And that was when I got my first paycheck from Avalon. But we had an 18-month period after the collapse of Claret where I worked with a team led by Donal to create what became Avalon. And I've been with Avalon for the decade since. So starting out running our business in the Americas, which was a bit of a joke because I hadn't been in the industry for a number of years. I've been a pricing and credit analyst when I've been in the early part of my career at RBS Aviation Capital. And so I spent the first couple of weeks Googling the names of the CFOs and fleet people at the various airlines and going from there. For the first 7 years of Avalon, I ran our business in that region and then created our manufacturer team, our OEM team, which was responsible for buying and selling all of our airplanes and engines and negotiating with the manufacturers. And then COVID happened and we created a new role in Avalon, which is this chief risk officer role. And I've been fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to do that job. I think fortunate is the word for it, I'm not so sure. But certainly risk is very much something that I've had to become comfortable with through what has been a fairly checkered and various career to this point.
Great, and very interesting backstory there. I'm sure we'll delve into that again throughout the session. Karl, would you like to give an introduction to your career?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. And again, thanks for the invitation to participate. And good to see Paul. As Paul mentioned, we met together when we worked together at RBS. But I started my own career in 1990. So I'd started off doing some mechanical engineering in Galway. I was doing a sort of 2-year diploma course, and it was very much technically orientated. And I was fortunate enough that I met a friend of mine down there, and about a year into the course, he pointed out that a company called Guinness Aviation was setting up a joint venture in Shannon, County Clare, and just south of Galway. And with that, I took a closer look, and he sort of advised me I should take an opportunity and maybe become an apprentice. So I left college or finished college and went into this apprenticeship. So my career has effectively been in starting up and running maintenance repair organization, starting off as an apprentice. This was in 1990, and it was during the, just as I started in June, we had the jobless recession. So this was around the sort of first Gulf War period. And at the same time, we as a group of apprentices that were set up in Ireland, there was about 40 in total to start with, split up and went to Hamburg to work with Lufthansa and Zurich to work with Swissair. So collectively, the 40 of us got to know each other very, very well for about 2.5 years, living away, coming back to Ireland, training, working on the aircraft, building up our experience and craft of being aircraft maintenance engineers. So with that, this new facility, this new joint venture opened. But when we graduated in 1992, it was a month or two from when GPA were planned to do their IPO, their flotation, which didn't go ahead and ultimately led to the demise of GPA. So GPA had been one of the key pillars of the joint venture with Shannon Aerospace. So change was pretty constant from the start of my career. And I know it's going to be a theme of discussion given where we are in the pandemic. But I went on and worked alongside this team with Swissair and Lufthansa in Shannon Aerospace, doing heavy maintenance on aircraft. And I learned about certifying aircraft disassembly, reassembly, testing, and then the commercial side of managing those type of projects, costs, delivery, timelines, and getting a closer look at how dynamic the airline industry really is. And then a very interesting time came in my career when, after rising through certain management roles in that organization, I'd got to know 1 or 2 people that had been coming in and out of Shannon Aerospace, and they offered me this opportunity to join a startup airline that was being sponsored by Richard Branson and a number of US investors that came over to Ireland and created a low-cost carrier called Virgin Express in Ireland. So it was sort of a change in my career, going from, you know, vertically through aircraft apprenticeship on through heavy maintenance, and then moving into a more dynamic airline environment. And we had to do it from scratch. So it was like a greenfield site, and we had to find aircraft. So we bumped into our good friends in GCAS and Bouillon and different lessors at the time, including AWOS. And we built a fleet of 20 737 300 and 400 aircraft and operated them across Europe. But only last for 2.5 years, because the airline eventually closed, was merged back with ultimately SM Brussels. And I found myself quite not as dramatic as Paul, but I did find myself in a situation where I ended up with no job. And what do you do at that stage? So I was fortunate enough that through those 10 or 12 years in my early career, contacts reached out, and I got, you know, work for a year in particular contract work. And then I had an opportunity, and this is where I met Paul, where together I joined RBS Aviation Capital at the time in December 2002. And I worked in the technical team there. So this is a shift from being in not just MRO or the live airline, but right into the sort of heart of a, you know, aircraft leasing and financing business that was just starting up as well. So whatever about me trying to learn my way in a leasing company, the guys around me were a couple of steps ahead of me, but they were figuring it out as they went along. But a great experience. And I think, again, there's lots of experiences hopefully Paul and I will take you through, but some of them, you know, really do make a big change in your career. And what I found was that just the different functions that you tend to work with over time, you start to realize that, you know, there's a whole broader set of skills out there that you need to start to learn. But like Paul, I worked alongside Donald, and you know, we were challenged quite a lot in the development of different business units. And one of the business units I was asked to create and start was an engine leasing business. So at the same time, when Paul and I were working on the pricing team, he went down the route of corporate jets and defense, and I had to look at building out an engine leasing business, which was quite interesting. So I progressed my career through RBS Aviation Capital. CIT came to Ireland and looked to set up and take advantage of Ireland, set up the CIT International, and I joined with a fine guy called Franklin Prey. Frank moved over from the US, set up this Irish office, and needed local people to work with him, and I went in there as the chief technical officer at the time. That wasn't for too long, because after a year we had the opportunity to join with a private equity firm called Terra Firma, who set up or bought AWOS. And at the time, AWOS was a smaller, you know, midlife, narrow body primary aircraft leasing business, but we built that business rather rapidly to over 350 aircraft. I worked there for 12 years, and ultimately we sold that business to Dubai Aerospace in 2018. Subsequently, I've started my career here at Genesis, so I'm currently the chief executive of the business, and I joined as the chief investment officer and chief commercial officer. So that's a bit of background from me, and maybe through the questions we can explore that a little bit further.
I think a neat summary, a neat summary of that seems to be that your career was flatlining until you met me, Karl.
Right?
That's what I got from it.
What is all this good? It was flatline, Paul, was it?
Yeah, I thought so. That's what I took from it.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Lucky to have met Paul then. Okay, so I think most people on the call so far have found the Q&A function, but there is a Q&A function if you have questions for Karl and Paul at either the bottom or the top of your screen. And there's also a chat function if you want to network or ask any questions on the initiative. Some of my colleagues are standing by to answer your questions. So I guess both of you have outlined such different and interesting careers so far. There may be more, but I'm wondering, can you pick out maybe one or two key areas that you think maybe you were in a position, I think both of you have shown us that you were both in positions that you didn't expect to be in, and how those positions led you to the career that you're in today, and if there was any real key learnings from those. Karl, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I think, look, again, when I was thinking about preparing for the discussion, I was really trying to find um, times in my career that I could sort of explain and maybe pass on that might be of help as to how we deal with situations. But the biggest thing I found is that you need to be ready for change, and change is going to come in many different ways. I mentioned there just on the intro, the flat intro, that it was the very fact that change was occurring from the very start. So I've had to, you know, realize that even though I'm making a lot of plans and in my own mind, we've got to take and be aware of what's going on around us. So when I joined Shannon Aerospace, I had planned to be, an aircraft engineer and build out a career just in the MRO space. But the more you expand your horizons, the more you see what's out there. And I actually packaged up a very interesting career in that organization, because I felt I needed to get more exposure in the airline side of the business. So rather than leave aviation, I expanded into the airline side. So I think making that change, going from what I felt was a successful career in aircraft maintenance, but stopping and pivoting into a space where I had only observed from a distance, and some of my skills were transferable. But I later found that there's a lot more skills out there that I had to learn or at least interact with. And it was the same when I moved from the airline into the leasing company. So it's, really about trying to understand and realize what the opportunities are around you. And I found that probably the more challenging piece of it, just taking those steps each time. But every time I've taken them, I felt that it's worked out rather well, and it's been very rewarding. Paul?
Yeah, I think so. If you think, Karl, about the group of people who are listening to us today, right? And that generation, like, I'm so impressed with the younger executives in the industry, and Avalon weighs heavily towards people with this level of experience, 10 years or less, and smart, engaged in the world, really keen to do well, and very focused on success in their own careers. And they're all good things. So I would emphasize, though, what Karl said, which is our careers, which are interesting, but I don't think they're in any way unique, show that there isn't usually a linear progression in your career, and you shouldn't seek one. So be wary, I think, of having a clear plan for the very job you want at some point in the future. Now, aspirations and goals are really important, but don't be afraid of those side avenues that will broaden you as an executive and ultimately help you more, rather than staying in one vertical all the time. And embrace change. Consider it inevitable. I see a question that's come in about what you and I may have learned in our careers about the leasing industry or the aviation industry. And I continue to be absolutely of the view that this is a structural growth industry. Do you believe the population in the world will continue to grow? Yes, I do. Do you believe that the middle class will continue to grow? I do. And do you think that as they do, they'll want to travel to improve their life experience? I do. So that's the structural underpinning of the industry, around which there is always going to be cyclicality. And so I think what we're seeing now is a very difficult moment for the industry, but a downturn was completely inevitable. And it won't be the last one that all of us go through if we remain in this industry. But recognize that underpinning that is structural growth. And most importantly, I think, Karl, that certainly my experience is I've learned far more in the downturns than I have in the good times.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, it's every time there's a change in your career, I find as you're, either ascending or level flight, clear level wings, quiet cockpit, your career progresses, but the real opportunities occur when you change direction. And sometimes that's forced because of external factors. That could be the case with some people as a result of the pandemic. but also as you walk through life, you're going to realize that there's more interesting areas or areas you could develop into, and embrace it. Because I've always said, when you have the good times, you should enjoy them. But when you have the difficult and challenging times, you got to be brave, because it's at that stage you're going to make the biggest impact on both your personal life and your career. So yeah.
And when we met, Karl, I would say I was 23, 24. And I think I got that lesson first from you, right? Because I'd come from a financial background, and most of the people I was around had come from a financial background. And it was like remarkable well, we obviously became such close pals. And so I learned about your story then, but it was an extraordinary example of somebody going through different steps and just being a much broader, better executive for it. If I recall correctly, you had hundreds of people reporting into you in Geaney Aerospace before you moved across to the leasing business, where you were starting in a very different environment, but without a team under you. I mean, that was fantastically brave, and ultimately, as we see now, positive thing for you to do.
Yeah, and I mean, the businesses were just operationally different. There was greater scale and operational requirements on the MRO side and the airline side, and that was probably one of the biggest shocks to me when I went into a leasing company. It was so small, and there was only so few people, and everybody had a clear place and function, and there was very little operational scale. All the scale was driven through financial leverage. But even though we crossed paths in that case, Paul, and you may have picked up a few things prior to this, we were just discussing and reminiscing a little bit. But it was the interaction I had with Paul gave me a lot of the analytical skills, because when I joined at RBS, I went in effectively as an engineer, and I was looking after the assets. I worked with a really good guy called Donald Boylan in the team. He led the group. And Donald gave us all the information, passed on everything he had, which is something we should all try and do with everybody. However, it was a very different set of skills that I needed. And I learned a lot of my Excel skills from Paul. And it was the first time I realized that you actually need a high level of competency on Excel. It's so important to be able to translate and do business. It's one thing I think we're lacking across the schools, and even post-secondary or third level. So that was very helpful. Paul's keyboard skills are well known.
I was actually just talking to somebody about this today as well, about the lack of Excel across the board at university level, and how that really could be introduced into more of the college courses there. I suppose just one of the things that has come up over and over again is there anything, looking at your career now, that you would change? Anything that you think you should have done sooner, just on the theme of education? And I see some questions coming in there around courses or how continuous development. Is there anything that you think you would like to have done sooner, or that you would change that you did do, but maybe would prefer not to have done? Paul, we'll start with you.
So one of the reasons I left Merrill was that it became obvious to me very quickly that the path when you joined those investment banks, and still the case today, as an analyst, you do 2 or 3 years and then they spit you out and you go and do an MBA, and then you kind of come back or go off into something else. And that cost $250,000, and that was never going to happen. And so that was a terrifying number for me, from where I came from, what I'd grown up with, just terrifying. So I realized that wasn't going to be a path for me. And actually, luck intersects at times in your career and in your life. And it certainly did in that instance, where I really went back to Ireland with nothing and met Donald Slattery. And I was running a global business for him 3 years later. And I've never looked back. And to be honest, I've never done any formal education beyond my barely passable 2-1 in arts. But although I haven't felt the need to go back and do formal education, again, Karl's story is different than he did, and I think that's definitely a story worth hearing. I have an insatiable appetite for knowledge. I love information. I find the world a fascinating place. And I think the people that do well in life and enjoy life and do well professionally are people who have real passion and interest in the world. And so I don't have an MBA or anything like that, but I am a voracious reader. And if I have a piece of advice to impart at this point in the conversation, it's that always try and create space. You know, I fear that there'll be, 400 pairs of eyes, if that's the number of people we have online, being raised to heaven if I say read the Air Finance Journal every time it comes out. I don't know about that. There's no harm in it. But read The Economist, even just the leaders, every week. If you read 4 or 5 pages at the front of The Economist every week, within a year, you'll be able to speak to anybody in your that you come into interface with about how the world works. And I was doing that corporate jet job back in my mid-20s. And what's interesting about that industry is that when you are talking about financing these assets, you're not dealing with a manager, you're dealing with the high net worth individual, typically, who owns them, because it's like his or her baby, it's their toy. And so I found myself sitting across the table from, very difficult, always very successful entrepreneurs in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and I was this 25-year-old kid. And I think the reason I was able to succeed in those interactions was that I could meet them where they were. If they were Israeli, if they were Brazilian, if they'd made their money in mining or they'd made it in property, I was able to do just about enough to hang in the conversation, ask the right questions and let it flow. And I think that has always been a big part of my success. So stay up with current affairs.
Interesting advice. It's something most people probably do to some extent, but it's interesting just to hear it as blunt as that. Karl, do you have any things you change?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't fully appreciate it until I stepped out of the aircraft maintenance side of it, but like it is highly regulated, so you can do nothing without doing a course. And I think I would say after about 10 years of being in that space, we were doing like certification exams every single year for it felt like 10 years, per type and per process. And so I felt I came to the end of it at that stage. And when I left and went into the airline, I had carried certification capabilities and experience so I could get recertified in the airline. But then when I came into the aircraft leasing space, I realized that there was a whole spectrum of experience and knowledge that I just hadn't been exposed to. I'd been possibly exposed to the fringes of it. I possibly were exposed to it from a practical perspective, interacting with lessors, negotiating with lessors, negotiating with airlines, but not necessarily structuring and financing. So I spent a lot of time trying to get up to speed extremely quickly. But I didn't go back and do anything particularly in university until probably 2006. I did an air accident investigation course because I felt at the time that if one of these things ever has a problem, one of these aircraft, being the either chief technical officer involved in the technical management of the aircraft, I just wanted to understand how I could protect the business and myself. And it was a really, really interesting period where I did it in London City, and got to learn a lot about that. But it wasn't really again until when I was with AWOS, because AWOS really, Terra Firma bought that business, and the idea really was to change the way aircraft leasing was done operationally. And we were very successful in doing that. We were probably the first aircraft leasing company to really internally rewire how our business operated from the ground up with a pretty expansive budget. And we spent about 4 or 5 years honing IT systems and process improvement, which became quite laborious, and it had its challenges to get the change into the organization, but it allowed us to be a lot more efficient, a lot more insightful on the information that we had. So I went and got involved in, green and yellow and black belt training for process improvement. And at a later stage, I was taking, this is probably I don't know how I made this decision, but I was 42 and I was flying from Dublin to New York, and I met an ex-colleague from RBS, John Slattery, and he said to me, "Hey, Karl, I'm just after finishing this course. You should go and do this MBA down in Limerick." And I said to him, "Do you know what, I'm going to do that. I've been thinking about doing something like this for a while." And by the time I landed, I sent an email off, and I spent 2 years during while I was the chief operating officer at AWOS, between 42 and 44, doing this executive MBA down in Limerick. And I have to say, it was an absolutely exceptional experience, because not only had I gone through the airline and the MRO business and experienced leasing and financing, this stitched it all together. So I'd sort of agree in one way. Paul touched on it, some people naturally go through and do their degree, maybe a year or two experience, and go into the MBA. I found it a lot more rewarding having a lot of experience under my belt and then applying it in against the academic side in the MBA. So that was really great. And that did give me an extra lift in my own sort of toolbox, effectively, of how I dealt with things. So from that point forward, I think I've used a lot of that, and it's brought me through my career since 44 over the last 5 years, 50 this year.
Happy birthday.
It's
great to see the difference as well, though, in career paths and I suppose educational paths as well, and that, as you said, Paul, earlier, it's not all linear. So people's journeys will be different and they will still be able to be successful, hopefully.
And Amber, forgive me, Bridget. There's a couple of questions that have come in. So super questions coming in that I'm kind of keeping half an eye on here. Now, I don't envy you having to manage myself and Karl and ask the questions, but there's two that I've spotted that we may have answered, but I want to bring them together and just make sure that we kind of give a direct answer. So one of them was, would you recommend a particular place to kind of get into the industry? And the other was, would you say that adaptability is key to success in the industry? So I'll answer the second one first. I think Karl and I are walking, talking examples of that. And if I would say anything, it would be that. Be adaptable. Recognize that if you want to be in this industry long term, you're going to see downturns, number one. And to be a really rounded executive, you're going to want to have done different things. And in terms of what's a great place to start, I think that's a really difficult question to answer, because lots of different people come at this industry with different skill sets. I mean, look at Karl and I. But I would say for all the people on this call, each one of you will come at it with a different set of skills. And so my advice wouldn't be to try and find the perfect entry point for future progression. Find the right entry point for you. And invariably over the 20 years in my career, but especially like over the last 10 when I've been managing people and watching young people come into the business, and some really excel and some maybe not so much. Show an interest in the work outside of your own job. So do your job to a world-class standard, for sure. That's base case, that's assumed. Beyond that, if you get an opportunity to attend meetings that aren't specifically relevant to you, do it. If you get an opportunity to take on a project outside your core job, do it. And really do, but also be seen to show an interest outside of your narrow vertical. That makes you better, but it also gets you noticed.
I think that's spot on, Paul. I think you need to spend some of your time looking left and right. Everything that's going on around you, in particular at times like this when businesses have to change priorities literally overnight, resetting what's important. Certain people step up and are capable of coping with that and moving forward. And I've seen it myself when I started my career, various stages, and even today, here at Genesis. We have a great team of, young, vibrant, dynamic people, really, really focused, and they're just making it happen. And it's one of these things where looking towards your colleagues, working with them, solving problems together as a team. You'll take this forward the next 5 or 10 years, and you'll look back, just like Paul and I have done over the last sort of 10 years or 15 years, and used it. So Paul's advice is great. It's spot on. Look left and right, work with your colleagues, get interested. Hopefully we're not sending a message into all these organizations where everybody's doing everybody else's job, but it's such an important piece.
There's a really interesting one there, Bridget. I'm not sure if you saw it come through. It's from an anonymous contributor, but it references this kind of, is it a natural adaptability that we seem comfortable with it, and whether you've got tips, Karl or me, for how to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think it's a brilliant question. Is adaptability innate, or is it a learned skill?
I don't know if it's innate or learned. What I would say is you get hardened to it a little bit. So over time, you get to realize that you're not meant to have all the answers. It's okay not to have all the answers. What's important is how you yourself or work with a team to contribute. And sometimes contributing is just listening, right? And storing it for the next time. Sometimes you need to take leadership role, even though you may not be the most senior person in the room. What I find is that over time, your experience base is going to allow you to make better judgment calls. And there's no race to be trying to be the first person to make a decision, but at the same time, you've great colleagues around you that you can work with.
Yeah, I think no doubt you build a tougher skin, Karl. And I think the great news is for everybody in this industry right now, whether we feel it or not right now, you're building a thicker skin right now. And you will all be much better executives in the years ahead for having gone through what we're going through now. And that's a reminder to think about the fact that we really do most of our learning in downturns. It can be hard to, because we're stressed. And in good times, I think it's easier to separate personal stress and professional. But in downtimes, if you're thinking about, God, is my job safe? Is the industry the right place to be? Has a loved one lost a job? In this case, has someone gotten sick with COVID? Like, it's very hard to separate the personal from the professional stress. But try. Actively recognize that that's hard. And I think for the person who asked that question, I don't think adaptability is innate. I think you learn it through experience, but as Karl said, but also actively force yourself. So go back to the basics. Is this an industry that has superb prospects long-term? Well, answer that question for yourself. But I have done that, done it multiple times over the last 2 decades, and I really believe it is. Accept that cycles are absolutely inevitable and vital for the industry. We can't determine when they come or their severity or what causes them. But if we accept that they are inevitable, then we stop feeling victimized by them. So this is long-term growth. It's going to have downturns within that. And by accepting that, I think you can start to build that adaptability. Okay, I'm going to take this opportunity, however difficult it is, to learn, recognizing I'm going to learn more in the next 6 months than I could learn in 6 years of the good times. And take it for the good that's there. Obviously, there's plenty of tough aspects of it too, but not to see it only as a downside. And I think if you view it in that kind of structured way, it allows you not panic, and that allows you then be adaptable.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think it's important to, take care of yourself during the downturn, because there's a lot of different stresses that come on. And, it's very different than what happened in the likes of 2008, when we all could come to work, and it was a sort of a financial supply side of the market that impacted us. Whereas here it's on the demand side, where passengers are just not in a position to be able to travel. So, each of these recessions are very different, and there's a lot to be learned during them. And I always say the work you do during the good times, it's all very evident when there's a drop in the market, because the tide goes out and you tend to see and observe what actual decisions you might have made 4 or 5 years ago and the effect it's had. So seeing that early on in your career, embracing it, learning it, looking left and right, as we talked about earlier, you'll have that going forward, both to apply in the current day-to-day job, but also in the future as you expand your own career.
And I think it's probably something everyone on this call today is going to experience quite early in their career, given our audience. So it's great advice. And just on that as well, Karl, you mentioned that early in your career, you reached out and it was through contacts that you ended up in RBS. So I was just wondering, on the networking and relationship side of things, do you have any advice for our audience in terms of networking and how building those relationships has really had an impact on your career? Karl, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, networking is important. I wouldn't sort of just term it an objective to go network. I think it starts at a very authentic level, how you interact with people, the rationale to why you're engaging and your contribution. I think a lot of younger people feel that they have to rush out and, they're supposedly trying to interact with everybody and pick up information. And I think that it's a lot subtler. I actually feel that you need to be, authentic in your conversation. You need to be able to contribute, even if it's small things, following up, listening, engaging. Everybody you meet, the people I work with, people I report into, people reporting to me, people on my team, it's just important to treat people at a very fair and reasonable way. Everybody needs a little bit of help. There's also a sense of, and I'm drawn on this a little bit because some of the questions that I'd seen come through were heavily emphasizing on the networking side. And I think it is important, but I wouldn't overemphasize it. I think your natural career is going to put you in contact with people, and the way in which you interact with them, the way you listen, learn, support, help, follow up, that is true networking in my mind. And you're going to meet people, in your own country or internationally as you travel in this industry. And, it's not necessary to be following up regularly with them. What I find is when it's necessary, reach out, and you basically, you pick up from more or less where you left off. Time doesn't seem to have a major impact from what I've seen. Now, there's a lot of generalization around networking, but I believe it's about your actual interaction and the way in which you dealt with people and the way you've engaged, dealt, and left that relationship and how it works. So.
Yeah, so I think there's one thing that we're in violent agreement on there, Karl, which it is there's not a lot of point in having lots of names in your contacts folder if you don't have any relationships with the people whose names you have in there. I think building a network of close contacts or of people with whom you have a good interaction is really important. And I think that was able to happen really organically 20 years ago when the industry was smaller, but it's gotten bigger. I think about, Karl, our early days in RBS, and you think about where so many of those people are today. So you've got CEOs of RBS Aviation Capital, Avalon, Goshawk, Sipiter, senior management at Genesis, of course, senior management at lots of other leasing companies. And they were all together in a small group then. And, we've obviously received a couple of emails from some of our former colleagues when they saw that we were doing this. So I think that where I would totally agree with you, Karl, that, a handshake and an exchange of business cards doesn't add huge value. Ensuring that you are building relationships through your business and through the industry is hugely valuable. And they just got to be real relationships or real contacts. And that's what's behind the work that Bridget and the committee and I've been doing on rising executives. ISTAT's been around for 40 years. It is the go-to, for want of a better word, and I just don't like the word, networking organization for the industry globally. And it has been doing nothing for anybody who's been in the industry for 10 years or less until now. It was a huge miss. You guys are hungry to understand how people who are doing something other than you in the industry, and I mean the industry widely, this is airlines and servicing companies and MROs and leasing companies and advisors and all the rest of it. And you're hungry to understand the industry, but you're young and it's hard to go and ask an expert. And so the way to do that is to have a way to interface with, spend time with people of a similar age to you guys or similar level of experience, who you can share your knowledge of what you're doing because they want to hear that, and they can share their knowledge of what they're doing. So really, that's at the heart of what we're trying to do with the rising executives, together with hearing perspectives from people who've been around a little bit longer, like Karl. And so we'll be asking all of you guys to play your part in building that really strong network amongst yourselves that we will facilitate in order for you to have that opportunity to build those strong networks. The people on this call, the people sitting around you with the same levels of experience, you yourselves are the leaders of this industry in 10, 15 years time. That's where the leadership is coming from.
Yeah, I was just going to say, hopefully we will be able to resume with some regional events soon and be able to facilitate that networking opportunity for people, young professionals in the industry. So fingers crossed that'll happen sooner rather than later. Okay, just before we kind of move into some more of the questions, do either of you have any parting advice that you would like to leave with our audience based on, I know you've imparted so much already, but is there anything in particular you'd like to offer? Karl, we'll go to you.
Well, I think first of all, you know, again, I think the rising executive initiative within ISTAT is it's really good, right? It's going to provide another layer of opportunity for interaction. I can see the different comments and questions that are coming in here, and you know, there's people actually interacting with each other, just even through this portal today. So it's important to remain connected. I think the other opportunities that exist within your own organizations, and you know, taking advantage of the time that we're in, because it's an amazing time. Even though we're deep into a recession, there's 2 vaccines out there that are highly effective. 2021 is going to be a very interesting year logistically as to how the airline industry starts to, you know, regain market share in markets where airlines had been very successful pre-COVID. It's going to be opportunistic for agile airlines to come in and maybe garner some of that market share. And then there's going to be a push to drive yield through those ticket sales. And you're going to be able to observe that whether you're on the airline side, the financing side, the leasing side. So there's a lot to be learned, and there's a lot of opportunity to practice. And then, you know, over time, as you see your career develop, as Paul and I mentioned, there's plenty of avenues to join or leave different facets of aircraft leasing or finance and join other parts of the aviation space, be it airlines or be it MRO or vice versa. So, you know, it's a really, really expansive industry. And I have to say, the 30 years I've been in it, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward now to the next sort of 20 years, depending on what's ahead, particularly here at Genesis. Paul?
Yeah, so 2 things. It's a brilliant time to be in this industry. Don't be fooled into thinking it's not. And if you make less money this year, or an opportunity that you thought was going to come your way as your business expanded 12 months ago and it's had to stop doing that for now, don't sweat that. In 2 years' time, we'll be looking back on 18 months of growth. And we'll be in the middle of a big upswing. So don't lose the opportunity to learn over the next few months through just stress around the industry. It will continue to grow. there's a question, Bridget, that you had, and maybe it's the question that actually that you just asked, and someone we've been talking about, and I see a few questions coming in terms of one good piece of advice that you got and all that. So it can be hard to boil anything down in that way, but there was one piece of advice that I got extremely early in my career, which I've never forgotten and honor to this day. So I was on my first or second day in a summer internship that I was doing for Merrill Lynch. So the summer of 2000, then I went back to college, and then I went back full time in New York. So I was the first or second day of my summer internship. So I was like a kid, I didn't know anything, but I was super excited and pleased with myself. And this senior guy, boss's boss, was having the one interaction that he would have with me and the other summer analysts that summer. He sat down with me and he said, "So, Paul, describe your role here for the next 3 months." Oh, so I very earnestly outlined all the things that I intended to do and what I was told I had to do and all that. And after a few minutes, he cut me off. He said, "That's all rubbish." He said, "Your job is to make your boss's life easier." And I have always taken that approach, and I continue to do it. My job is to make Donald Slattery's life easier. He has given me a set of responsibilities, and it is for me to fulfill those, to find them, fulfill them in such a way that makes his life easier. His job, by the way, is to make his board's life easier. And with every single role I've had, they've all sounded completely different industries, even finance, banking, leasing, starting an airline. I've never lost the fact that that's really fundamentally what you have to do.
Make Karl's life easier.
Donald's life must be very easy at this stage, Paul.
I have an interesting question here, and it's aimed at you, Karl, but I think it applies kind of to more scenarios than what the person who's asked the question has applied it to. So they've asked, were there any major hurdles going from the technical background into the finance side of the industry? But I think it really applies to both of you across the different jumps in career that you've had. So maybe, Karl, you could start, but Paul, if you have anything to note on that as well. Was there anything really fundamental that you found difficult, or do you think it's really just a learning process that everyone goes through?
My experience, I sort of set it out there, moving from the airlines into leasing, not having had the financial background. Had I thought more about it, I probably could have taught myself out of it. But what I have to say is, and the question's great because it reminds me of going into RBS Aviation Capital in that sort of capacity with an engineering and sort of airline background, which is ultimately the customer. So I had a sort of a connection point with the final customer. However, I didn't have the raw materials I thought initially, because most people in that organization were coming from a different perspective. But what I realized is my skills were so valued by that team, and likewise their skills are so valued by myself, that it's a natural fit. So whether you're coming in as a lawyer from a real estate side, or if you're coming in as an accountant where you're working in an industrial company, it really doesn't matter. A lot of it is around the social and interactive fit, how you work in teams, how you support each other, and really how you care for your colleagues. You really need to be able to build an environment and a culture where actually you're welcomed, right? So it's all parts of the puzzle are required in order to solve the problem. And so I think it's more in people's mind about making those steps. It's a very tangible industry. Aircraft leasing, the most sophisticated component on the planet, right? Large capital expense, operated in every country of the world. So it requires, a myriad of disciplines to make it work. And the choreography of that is really through the culture and the capabilities of the team. So looking back, it was so much easier. I'd say if somebody sat me down and tried to convince me not to do it, I might have listened to them. So the barrier to entry is a lot lower, I think, from that point of view. And then I learned my keyboard skills from Paul, so that was great.
Paul, do you think you had any major hurdles between different roles?
I think it's naive
okay,
to think that people can't get boxed in. That can't happen. Your responsibility is to avoid it happening. You do that by showing a general interest in the company with your particular role. And, you know, as we say in Ireland, show them for the ball. Do more than the bare minimum. And obviously, I've seen some questions about company and team culture. Culture is important. And so Karl can't speak to the culture of another company, and nor can I. But assuming that it's a healthy culture, you should be able to speak to your line manager and say, I love what I'm doing. I really want to grow. And in time, I may want to look at something elsewhere in the business. What do I need to be able to accomplish that? It's wonderful when you're able to have an open relationship with your line manager, but of course that's a function of the dynamics between those two people at any given time.
Just one point there I'd add. We talk a little bit about each individual function and how you move from function to function and how you enter a business or possibly leave to go somewhere else. But I think everybody has a responsibility to stitch the social fabric together in an organization. And it's not just the leadership or the management, clearly not just the individual, but participating in forming the culture of an organization is going to stead you well, because you need to be a team player. You need to be included, particularly early on in your career, and wherever you can add to the greater good of the business, and making an environment where people feel, challenged to basically perform at a high level, but not distrusted or questioned beyond necessary. So it is an important piece, and I feel, looking back over the years, the great companies that I've been fortunate enough to work with all had that common thread to it. They had this innate ability to basically stitch together the fabric of a culture that allowed everybody to perform at the highest level.
We've had so many questions and I don't know where to go next, to be honest. Paul, we have somebody asking about your mustache and asking, have you always had it, or is it a weapon in your arsenal? Maybe you can explain the good cause that your mustache is for.
So I happened to have a webinar last week. Investment Bank was doing a web conference, and it was the first question I was asked on that, and it's only one of the last here, so that's progress. Yes, this is for charity and say for comedy. It is not my best look, but there's a charity called Movember, or No Shave November, which actually I think started in Australia or New Zealand, but it's a big thing in certain parts of the world, and we grow our facial hair for November and raise money, and that goes to men's health causes. So apologies for for having to put you through it all, or put you all through it, but that's what it's for. It will disappear in 11 days.
Good cause. I suppose one of the questions that came up was, if you weren't working in aviation, where do you think you would be working? And boy band does not count.
Go on, Paul, you take this to start.
Karl, are you kidding me?
I know boy band was your answer, Paul, and that's why I had to put this statement out there.
I never thought I'd be in aviation, and I've never since thought why I wouldn't be. I ultimately found myself in the industry for 10 or 12 years, doing, obviously, as I've described, different things. And I would say that at that point, I consciously determined that the skill set within this industry, although it's like financial services, the leasing part of this industry is, it is quite a unique asset, as Karl has described. And so it did start to become apparent that I would be able to have the kind of career progression and make the kind of, personal return that I wanted to by staying in this industry. That because of the network that I built, the skills that I'd learned, and the esoteric nature of the asset, that I could go off and do something else, but I wouldn't have that same mixture of things that made it a really enjoyable, fun place for me to work and to progress. So I would say that I have been quite focused on being in this industry, for a period of time, but that certainly wouldn't have been the case through my 20s. What other might I have done? I might have gone into politics.
Interesting. Not a straight answer though.
I probably would have never been voted in by anybody, so that would have been brief, and I probably would have ended up in aviation anyway.
It's the back to the future question, right? So if you were to go making any changes historically, would it have actually impacted where we are today? For myself, look, I suppose I've always been in aviation, so I haven't really thought about leaving at all. I suppose the closest point I got to questioning what I'm going to do is when I worked at Virgin Express and the airline had to close. And that's difficult when somebody's telling you, listen, you guys have done a fantastic job. You've built this airline out. You've worked hard at it. It's a tough gig. And then to find out that actually we're closing it because the decision has been made. And so I had to think about it because, like Paul had mentioned, for similar to himself, like I had a family, kids, what do you do? And Route 101 is you need to have an income. And but I stayed in the industry at that point, and I didn't really think of leaving, but I sort of had to consider what my options were. I think it's a great industry because you can move from vertical to vertical, right? So, whether it's aircraft leasing or aviation lending or the airline or MRO or trading, there's ground handling, there's air transport side of it, the ATC. So there's so many different components, and so it's a big enough space to actually find the right place. And if you have to move out of one particular area for whatever reason, or you've drawn interest into another area, it's a fine business to navigate around.
That's great. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. But if anybody has any further questions or feedback on today's session, please be sure to get in touch with either myself or some of the other ISTAT Rising Executive colleagues. Our information is on the ISTAT website, or you can contact ISTAT headquarters as well. We really appreciate any feedback, and we will hopefully have a survey for you all. I'd like to thank Karl and Paul for their wisdom and for their time today on our session, and for all our attendees who joined in and were very active in both the chat and questions. I can't believe how many questions we got. There will be a recording of today's session available on the ISTAT website for anyone who would like to rewatch or share it. And just on finishing up, I'd like to invite all of our participants to invite one other person to join ISTAT Rising Executives. Our plan is to host events regionally and soon, hopefully. So once we get that up and running, the more the merrier. So thanks again to Karl, Paul, all the organisers, and to all our attendees today.
And Bridget, thank you very much. It was great to come on, and you've done a great job. It's a great step, as I mentioned earlier on, the Rising Executives, a great initiative. And I know, Paul, you've been heavily involved in building this out, so well done to both of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Karl.
Magic. Thanks so much, Bridget. Karl, an absolute pleasure, pal, as always.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Bridget.
Bye-bye.